hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 144 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday still morning here in New York. But if you're checking out this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content but haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch episode 144 on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today is the 31st anniversary of the release date for a film which may seem a bit of a trifle these days, but it was a movie that in the pre-internet era had people going nuts. People were debating it and arguing about it even before it came out, and all of the chatter helped to make the movie an enormous box office hit, kind of in the erotic thriller genre, although to call it an erotic thriller is a big stretch. I mean, it's not a Basic Instinct, maybe an erotic drama, but even that feels like a stretch. It's a straightforward drama that deals with a Faustian bargain, and it was the Faustian bargain of the title, Indecent Proposal, that got people talking. And the first trailer, which had Robert Redford, still a very vital, and I guess he was in his mid-50s at the time. Yeah, he was in his mid-50s. Still considered an exceedingly good-looking guy. Robert Redford, we're led to believe in the trailer, is a billionaire. And Demi Moore and Woody Harrelson are a young couple that appears to have hit a little bit of hard times, a little bit of true history, which was that the country was going through kind of a recession, and it would make sense that these two people who are presented, Woody is an architect, very good at his job, and Demi is a realtor, very good at her job, and the recession basically gives them the double middle-fingered salute, and then they're in trouble. They end up in Vegas, and they meet this billionaire played by Robert Redford. But in the trailer, what got people talking immediately is Redford, who's wearing what looks like a $10,000 Italian cut, hand-tailored suit, $100,000 wristwatch. He basically asks a question: what if I offered you $1 million for one night with your wife? And that's all he says. We assume he means $1 million for sex, but he never actually says that. But people started chattering and fighting and arguing before we knew if this movie was any good or whether people were going to see it. The assumption was it was going to do big business because of the pre-release chatter, which, as I say, was very unusual in the pre-internet age and era to have so many people fighting about a movie they hadn't seen, a lot of arguing among columnists in newspapers of the day and TV hosts, Liz Smith, Cindy Adams, dishing and gossiping about it. And the advance buzz on this movie was huge. Now, history tells us the film, it's not great. I would argue that it's certainly worth seeing, but the story kind of falls apart in the second half. The setup is fantastic. And I should also point out the filmmaker, Adrian Lyne, this was not the only film in his career that had people white hot, raging, arguing about the substance, the text, the subtext, the historical implications, the socio-political implications. He did Fatal Attraction in 1987. And that movie was also massively controversial and hot-button topics. Is there such a thing as free love? Can a man who is happily married with a daughter, can he ever be the good guy in a movie? How bad do we have to make the bad guy for us to root for somebody who basically is just punting away his marriage for a little bit of quick sex? So Adrian Lyne got a lot of acclaim and an Oscar nomination for Fatal Attraction. He also did Flashdance. Very, very talented filmmaker with a wonderful eye for composition. 9.5 Weeks, although not a great movie, looks great. And Kim Basinger and very young Mickey Rourke. I mean, they look fantastic together. They look gorgeous together. But Lyne also did Jacob's Ladder, one of my favorite horror films of all time. And in that movie, he was the only director who thought that he could do it, because every filmmaker from Scorsese and especially Spielberg, who thought the Jacob's Ladder script was one of the 3 or 4 best he'd ever read, there's no way to make this into a movie. Great read. I want to work with Bruce Joel Rubin, whoever he is, but this can't be a movie. Adrian Lyne figured out how to make a movie out of an unfilmable screenplay. So we know we're talking about a talented artist in Adrian Lyne, not a guy who was just putting out crap deliberately. So the movie did end up being a humongous box office hit, close to 270 million worldwide gross, which would be a great gross for 31 years ago if it were a big action movie, like a Lethal Weapon film, or even something like The Rock a number of years later with Nicolas Cage. For a movie of this type, a so-called erotic drama, a Faustian bargain story that doesn't have any shit blowing up real good, and got shitty reviews, 34% on Rotten Tomatoes, which means 2/3 of critics gave the old Siskel and Ebert thumbs down, and some critics were really angry that the movie had even gotten made. It turning that big of a profit, it's pretty fucking impressive. But it showed enough people who saw it after the initial buzz and the excitement of, what would you do? Enough people recommended it to their friends and acquaintances, coworkers, whatever it might be. It had enough interest that people saw it. And my aunt went to an advanced screening and she hated it. And my aunt, my dad's sister, is just about the biggest Robert Redford fan of all time. She loves Robert Redford, whether it's The Natural, whether it was Out of Africa, whether it was even Legal Eagles, which is on Netflix, by the way. That's kind of a lesser Redford film, but it's one of the few flat-out comedies he made. He's fucking money. Whatever that guy does, and whatever that guy did, he was great at it. Even being silly in a comedy with Deborah Winger and Daryl Hannah and Terrence Stamp. But my aunt reported back, it's trash. It is a terrible movie. And I was so frustrated because everyone looks great. Demi looks great. And she had been a fan of A Few Good Men, so she was not anti-Demi Moore. And she had liked White Men Can't Jump, if my memory serves. So she was not anti-Woody Harrelson. Or maybe it was that she knew him from Cheers. Either way, she went into the movie hoping it was going to be good, and she thought it was terrible. And she was angry that she had gone. What a piece of shit this was, or words to that effect. But people saw it. People liked it. Now, what I've always found interesting, Robert Redford, Oscar-winning filmmaker for Ordinary People, a dozen years earlier, was just an actor on this film. He did not have a piece of the production. He wasn't involved in anything other than coming to the set, getting into, character and costuming and wearing a lot of fancy, super expensive clothes and reading his lines. Adrian Lyne's original idea was to cast a normal-looking actor as, well, his name is Gage, John Gage, G-A-G-E, in the world of the film, the billionaire. He liked the idea, and it's kind of logical, that it's a I hate to say ugly guy because that's really absurd, but a normal-looking person making this indecent proposal. You could have gone with a Roy Scheider. You could have gone with, because Dustin Hoffman was in talks. Hoffman was the guy they had targeted to do this. And Hoffman was still very high on the Hollywood mountain at this juncture because his Oscar for Rain Man was not that many years before when this film was in the stages where it was going out to actors. And Hoffman was working, he'd done Hook with Robin Williams and Bob Hoskins, and he did the movie Hero with Gina Davis and Andy Garcia. So he was working steadily. Dustin Hoffman would have been a fascinating choice, and it would have almost added a little bit of an unconventional element to the story. And this is why they wanted to do it this way, because if the implication is that she's going to have sex with this guy, then it's a real, I hate to say it, but it's a tougher choice, quote unquote. But then when Hoffman either passed, and it's funny because Hoffman was also offered In the Line of Fire, which ended up going to Clint Eastwood literally in this particular time frame, within a couple of months. Hoffman, thank goodness, Dustin, I love you. Thank goodness Dustin Hoffman did not want to do In the Line of Fire. But what he did do, if you ever wondered who came up with the idea to have the Secret Service agent, which ended up being played spectacularly well by Clint Eastwood, who came up with the idea? Was it in the original script that the Secret Service agent had been on duty and on call and standing next to Kennedy when he got shot? That was Dustin Hoffman's idea. That was not in Jeff McGuire's original, Yeah, Jeff McGuire. I'm sorry. Jeff Apple was one of the producers. I get the Jeffs mixed up on In the Line of Fire. Jeff McGuire's original screenplay did not have the JFK angle. It was Dustin Hoffman who suggested it, and even though he bowed out of the project, the people at Castle Rock, whether it was Rob Reiner, said, "What a fucking genius. Thank you, Dustin," because honestly, that's one of the best components of that film. So, Dustin Hoffman in that period was so high on the mountain that he was turning down huge projects, like In the Line of Fire and like Indecent Proposal. So when Hoffman didn't do it, and maybe they said, should we go, please, again, forgive me if this is ridiculous. I mentioned Roy Scheider. Could we go to Charles Bronson? Maybe Nicholson? Nicholson would have been an interesting choice. But from my memory of Adrian Lyne discussing the film when it was coming out, he wanted Redford. He liked the idea of it not being a conventional decision for Demi's character of Diana. And the other thing that people were buzzing about before the movie was released, and then when it was released, was the problem with the film, and it was kind of a humorous, it wasn't really a problem with the film, is that if a 55-year-old billionaire who looks like Robert Redford is asking a woman to just have sex with him, just forget the $1 million, she's probably going to leave Woody Harrelson anyway. And that got a lot of traction, and that got a lot of laughs. And critics of the day, from David Denby, Roger Ebert, Gene Siskel, and Joel Siegel, a lot of the big critics, Dennis Cunningham, they talked about this and kind of had fun with it, whether or not they liked the movie. But Redford, the original conception of the character that he ends up playing and played so well in this movie, and I talked about Redford repeatedly on the channel, not known as a master thespian, but in the right role, absolute gold. And this, although not a great movie, he's perfectly cast. And it's hard to imagine why they would have wanted, Dustin Hoffman, his old buddy, runs rings around him in terms of acting chops, no question. But Dustin or Roy Scheider or whoever they were talking about, even Jack, would not have played this part as well as Redford, because Redford came up with ideas that, I'm telling you, helped the film immeasurably. And there are people still debating this. But the original conception of the character of John Gage was not that he was evil, but that he basically was a scumbag, pretty much of just an asshole with a lot of money who threw his money around. Now, there is that element is still in the script. But what Redford fought for and what he wanted to make the character he was playing more interesting than what was presented in the script. And so, of course, he met with Adrian Lyne. He talked about what he thought could work. And Adrian Lyne ended up agreeing with what Redford suggested, his own actor notes, if you will. The kind of thing that if he was a producer, he would have been involved with anyway. But even though he was just an actor, Adrian Lyne had a ton of respect for him. So what Redford did was, rather than ever saying that he is paying $1 million to have sex with the character of Diana, as played very, very solidly by Demi Moore, he just says, for one night. He doesn't say $1 million for sex. And there is a scene that is a great movie scene, because as I say, the first half of this film, I think, is very, very strong. And then it kind of goes off the rails. But when, spoiler alert, Demi and Woody agree to go through with it, because you hate to say they need the money, but they need the money. $1 million now. This is about the equivalent of what would be $2 million or more, inflation adjusted if it were today. Demi has a set of assumptions for what the night with Gage is going to be. She assumes there'll be, lap of luxury, and she's right about that. But her assessment and assumption of the night is, as soon as they're alone, should I just get naked? And Redford handles this sequence so beautifully, and this was part of him wanting to make his character more interesting and adding shadings to it. And without coming out and saying it, he tells her, in no uncertain terms, nothing is going to happen tonight that you don't want to happen. Essentially saying, I didn't spend $1 million for sex. I can get that anywhere. I wanted to spend a night in your company. And if you're not into it, it's okay. Keep your clothes on. Spoiler alert, the fact that Demi goes through with it anyway, even though all she has to do is chill, drink champagne, or stay sober and just hang out with this billionaire on his yacht. She is under no strain, no pressure. The money has already been wired. He's not going to welsh on it. He's putting it in her court, and she decides to do it with Bob, or John in the movie. And that was also very controversial when the film came out and people were, the Roger Eberts of the world, spoiler alert, I'm going to have to go into certain spoilers, as he said in his review. So Redford's fighting for his character to have a greater level of humanity and more shadings. Still controversial. I just read an article the other day from one of the original writers that said, I love Robert Redford, but I feel like we shouldn't have listened to him. I disagree. It makes the first half of the movie, to me, a lot more fascinating and more realistic, given what we know. So the film is not great. Doesn't turn out the way we quite expect. And unfortunately, there's a lot of plot mechanics and plot machinery, which I just don't buy. It's just nonsense. And a lot of stuff happens that I would argue would never, ever happen in the real world. And I don't mean because the film takes a science fiction turn or surrealist, but there are character actions that are taken by Woody's character of David, Demi's character of Diana, and also Redford's character of Gage. Like, he wasn't able to change the character entirely, presumably the way that he wanted. His character still does a couple of really idiotic things that a person of his intelligence would not have done. No way. But it's a movie. We go along with it. Watching the film now, I think it still works, especially the first half. It's still compelling, and it is a great study of movie star. I don't want to say movie star ethic, but it's a film ultimately about a movie star, in this case, Robert Redford. And we can see him, if we choose, as Robert Redford. And the kind of, I hate to say it this way, but the fairy tale fantasy of an ordinary woman, even one who looks like Demi Moore, a film star, a movie star, taking an interest in her and wanting her. And Redford is playing up his star persona, even though his character is a little grimy and a little dirty in certain ways. He flashes that $1 million smile. He gets to smile a lot in this movie. His hair looks great. Everything about his presentation screams movie star. And Demi was a big star in her own right. She ended up headlining a number of movies within that decade. Most of them sucked, from The Juror, and she did The Scarlet Letter, and most famously and most disastrously, the adaptation of Carl Hiesen's phenomenal book, Striptease. But Demi was a star herself, and I feel like Line kind of took advantage of it a little bit. To my liking, there's a little bit too much of her lounging around naked or 90% naked. It's just like, it's not needed for the movie, in my opinion. I hate to say that he threw some of those shots in there because he wanted to sort of balance it off, or maybe he was just showing off, my God, look at how gorgeous this woman is. I don't know. But the movie, as we say, ended up being a massive box office hit. And people continue to talk about it. And there is still a lot of debate as to whether the movie is successful at all, or whether it was just a botch that ended up being a huge hit because of the central premise. And you can argue that it doesn't do enough with that premise. Like, I feel like this is one of those movies. It's another thing Roger Ebert and Siskel used to kind of joke about. There are certain films that are begging to be remade. And then we get movies that don't need remakes that get remade instead. This movie, or a variation on it, there was a better movie to be made from it, where the second half would be just as compelling as the first and not have these crazy turns of plot that don't really, not that they don't make sense logically, but that'll just never happen. You're just not going to do this. Nobody's going to do this, and then that, and then this, and then this person's going to, no. If Hollywood is going to remake a polarizing, controversial film from the 90s, this is the one I would suggest. Just throw out the second half and come up with something different. And, in the words of Emperor Joseph in the movie Amadeus, just cut a few and it'll be perfect. Just change the second half of the movie, come up with a couple of ideas and it'll be perfect. The film did help Demi's career and Woody Harrelson. And Redford was just doing what he was doing. He was just going to continue doing his thing anyway. He continued to work in the decade. He made movies like The Horse Whisperer a little bit later in the decade, which I believe was Scarlett Johansson's film debut, if I'm not mistaken. Worked with Kristen Scott Thomas, who was coming off The English Patient. And Sam Neill. I think Sam Neill was in that movie, yeah. I would like to have seen Montana. One of the all-time best, where one character in one movie played by the same actor in another movie, where you can even match it up and laugh. In a movie, The Hunt for Red October, in 1990, Sam Neill's character is Russian and he's emigrating, he hopes, to the United States with Sean Connery's Lithuanian submarine captain, Marco Ramius. And when the two guys are talking, if we're able to do this, what would you like to do? And Sam Neill says, I want to live in Montana and I want to marry a round American woman. And then Sam Neill's last line in the movie, The Hunt for Red October, is, I would like to have seen Montana. And I gotta believe that Robert Redford, who directed The Horse Whisperer, knew damn well that Sam Neill had uttered the line, I would like to have seen Montana in The Hunt for Red October, because in the movie The Horse Whisperer, Sam Neill's character is living where? He's living in Montana. He would like to have seen Montana, and thanks to Robert Redford, the filmmaker, he was able to finally see Montana 8 years later in a different movie playing a different character, but it works just the same. I do recommend you watch Indecent Proposal. It's streaming on Paramount Plus and Showtime. If you've never seen it, it is worth your time. It is compelling, and it is just the central hook is enough to get you in and draw you in. And the beauty, the way that Adrian Lyne, his painterly eye, which we saw in movies like Flashdance, like Fatal Attraction, some of the incredible shot compositions in that movie, and Jacob's Ladder. I don't know how he did Jacob's Ladder, how he pulled it off, but he pulled off, as they say, an impossible script and made it sing. And it is a great horror film, easily top 10 best horror films ever made, if you ask me. And Bruce Joel Rubin's script, top 5 greatest screenplays I've ever read for sure. Just phenomenal. But it is also, Indecent Proposal is also a case study in something that is ethereal. It's very difficult to pinpoint and put your hand on it as, is this a real component? Is this a tangible element, or is this just something that exists in the ether and in the nexus and we can't really explain it? But for example, later in the decade, M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, I See Dead People, that line helped the movie to become the phenomenon that it was. Now, it would have been a different kind of phenomenon if, in fact, it was not a good thriller, and if it sucked and it didn't have an incredible jaw-dropping twist that most people, including myself, didn't exactly see coming. But when you ask, how does a movie nowadays, how does buzz build, even with the internet, with things going viral so quickly? How do you do it? How do you drum up interest? How do you get people psyched and geeked to see a movie? I don't really think there's an answer. But if we look at 1993's Indecent Proposal, Robert Redford's one line in the trailer, just the one line, was enough to get people going batshit crazy, arguing and fighting. Suppose I were to offer you $1 million for one night with your wife. That question is what got people talking and fighting. Whereas Fatal Attraction, people were fighting and arguing simply because we understood what the concept was. Happily married man has an affair with a woman who might be not the best choice to have an affair with if you're going to go down that road, which you shouldn't, asshole. There is something in those individual beats or moments in movies that we remember. Redford's line reading, that moment in the trailer, is what got people excited, in every sense of the word excited, just as I See Dead People, years later, was instrumental in The Sixth Sense becoming what it was. Indecent Proposal directed by Adrian Lyne, starring Demi Moore, Woody Harrelson, and Robert Redford, released on this day, 1993. A movie worth seeing if you haven't, and at least for the first half, worth checking out if you already had. It's streaming on Paramount Plus and Showtime as we speak. This has been episode 144 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this Sunday morning here in New York. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, and turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 145 real soon. Till then, peace.